In this lesson, we'll look at selecting loops of points and primitives. Double left or double middle clicking when in point or primitive selection mode has a different behaviour to when we're in edge selection mode. Rather than selecting a loop as it does in edge selection mode, if we double left or double middle click on a primitive in primitive selection mode, it selects the whole connected piece of geometry. And if I switch to point selection mode by tapping the 2 key and double click on a point, we see it does the same thing and selects the whole piece of connected geometry. I'll switch back to primitive selection by tapping the 4 key, and to select a continuous primitive loop, like we have around the circumference of the tube, we can just use the technique of selecting one primitive, holding down the A key and middle clicking on another primitive along the loop. Or we can hold down the A key and middle mouse drag across 2 primitives in the direction of the loop that we want to select. If I just deselect these and now do the same and hold down the A key or middle mouse drag in this direction along a primitive between the 2 boundary edges, then just like when using this technique to select edge rings, it only selects the loop in the direction that we drag. So to select a full loop running between the geometry's boundaries, we've got a couple of different techniques we could use. One is to do as we've just done here and select the loop of primitives in one direction, and then hold down the Shift key together with the A key and middle drag in the opposite direction. That leaves us with a full loop selected, but having to do it in 2 steps isn't particularly convenient. We could of course just hold down the A key and middle drag from the boundary of the geometry, which is fine in this instance, but if we were working with a larger piece of geometry and zoomed in where we can't see the geometry boundary, then we'd usually want to be able to make that selection without having to reframe the view. The second option's a simpler one, and it's new to Houdini 19.5. If I select a single primitive again, which I can do by either left clicking or middle clicking on it, now with my cursor hovering over this selected primitive, if I hold down the A key, we get this dark blue highlight for all the primitives which will be selected when we middle click on the primitive under the cursor. If I release the A key and now press it again, we see that the full loop in the opposite direction is now highlighted. Each time I release and press the A key, I toggle the direction of the primitive loop which will be selected when I middle click on it. So now with this loop of primitives highlighted, I can just middle click on the primitive under the cursor and that selects the full loop. Now this technique currently only works for selecting loops of primitives in either direction. If I switch to point selection mode and select a single point, and now hold down the A key and hover over the point, we don't see any of the other points being highlighted. If I middle click on this point with the A key held down, none of the other points get selected. So to select a full loop of points, we can use the technique of selecting a point, and then holding down the A key and middle clicking on another point to select all the points along the loop in a single direction. Or we can hold down the A key and drag across 2 points. And this works well for continuous loops like this, but to select a full loop of points between the boundary edges, then we would need to either use the same technique of holding down the A key and middle dragging to select the points in one direction, and then holding down Shift and the A key and middle dragging to select all the points along the loop in the opposite direction. Or what's possibly an easier method is to switch to edge selection mode and double left click on an edge to select the whole edge loop, and then convert that edge selection to a point selection by tapping Ctrl Shift and the 2 key. And converting selections from one component type to another is something that we're going to be looking at in detail later on in this course. So in this lesson, we've seen the different techniques we can use for selecting loops of primitives and points.